Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, and for the next few episodes, we're going back to our series that we've been doing for much of this year, called Politics on Trial, about the most significant, the most interesting trials in history. Political trials, but also trials that reveal something about the politics, the temper of their age, and reveal something about our age too. Today, it's a truly extraordinary trial. It took place 100 years ago, in the summer of 1925. It became known as, and has been known as this ever since, Scopes Monkey, or the Monkey Trial. For this series, Politics on Trial, there is a website that I use that I want to pay homage to because I don't think I could do this series without it. It's an amazing resource. It's called Famous Trials. It's curated by a man called Douglas Linder, Professor Douglas Linder. I have to say I don't know much about him. It seems to be a labour of love. And on it, there are 100 trials and all of the documents and information that anyone could need who wants to find out what happened. Court transcripts of investigations and interrogations, newspaper reports, the reports of higher courts, appeal verdicts and judgment. All of it is there. It's fantastic. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is that on the site, roughly half the trials, I think maybe even exactly half, there are 150 of them are from the 20th century. And at a certain point, Douglas Linder, as the proprietor of this site, was asked to nominate his trial of the century. And I think he was being encouraged to say it was the O.J. Simpson trial. And he said it's not the O.J. Simpson trial. There is clearly a winner if the question is, what was the trial of the 20th century? And the winner is the one I'm going to be talking about today. The Scopes trial, or to give it its much more common name, Scopes Monkey. And I agree with him. I think he's right. There is nothing like it. So here are some of the reasons why this is the blockbuster trial of the 20th century. First of all, because of what it was about. It was about creationism versus evolution. It was the Bible versus science. It was, in its own way, the 20th century version of Galileo versus the Inquisition, though it was the 20th century version. So this is in the age of mass circulation newspapers and the beginning of the age of radio. There were daily radio reports from the trial. There were hundreds of journalists there. It is said that more information passed on transatlantic cables about the Scopes trial in the summer of 1925 than any other event to that point in American history. The world was watching. And part of the reason people were so fascinated by it is that the contest was so clear. It was a case that was brought against a young schoolteacher called John Scopes, who was accused of teaching evolution, Darwinism, in the local high school, a Tennessee public school, a state school. And just a few months earlier, so not long before the trial, a new law had come onto the Tennessee statute book, which prohibited the teaching of evolution or evolutionary theory. I'll just read the statute. It's very short. It's pretty clear. The statute said, "It shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, and other public schools of the state being Tennessee, which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state, to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals." That was the law, and John Scopes was charged with breaking it. Everybody could understand what this was about, and in a way, what was at stake. But that's not the only reason it was such a blockbuster, because it also had an amazing cast of characters among the lawyers. The two lead, or at least most famous lawyers on each side, were two of the most famous men in America. Defending Scopes was Clarence Darrow, by that point probably the most famous trial lawyer in the country. He had made his reputation in part the previous year, defending Leopold and Loeb in another blockbuster trial, another one that's on the Famous Trials website, and actually one we'll be talking about later on this podcast when we put out the episodes that we've been recording at the Regent Street Cinema. The first of those is about Rope, Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, which was based on a play, which was based on the Leopold and Loeb case, the case of a child murder by two young men who had been corrupted by Nietzsche. And Darrow didn't get them off, but they didn't get the death penalty. Darrow was a superstar lawyer. On the other side, prosecuting, was a man much more famous than Darrow, William Jennings Bryan, who had 3 times been the Democratic nominee, the Democratic Party's nominee for president of the United States. He had run as the presidential candidate in 1896, in 1900, in 1908. He was one of the great politicians, political figures of the age, the great populist, the great commoner, as he was known, the representative of ordinary Americans, the man who had made a career standing up for ordinary Americans, poor, working, rural Americans, against all the elites who were determined to do them down. And here he was, in what turned out to be the final act of his life, once again defending ordinary Americans, the ordinary people of Tennessee, against those who would try and mock or ridicule or stifle their beliefs. Darrow versus Bryan. And covering the trial amidst all of the newspaper reporters was someone who, partly because of his coverage of the trial, was going to become perhaps the most famous journalist in America, H.L. Mencken, the great mocker and cynic, the man who ridiculed America's pieties and ridiculed public opinion, ridiculed the views of the common man. Mencken came to mock Bryan. He seems to have had completely unbridled contempt for Bryan and all that he stood for. It was Mencken who coined the term monkey trial for this trial. It's thanks to Mencken that Dayton became known as Monkeytown. But it's not just the presence of Darrow and Bryan and Mencken that make this trial so extraordinary. It's something that happened which pretty much never happens in a trial, however much people might want it to happen, including the lawyers. How often must lawyers have wished that they didn't just get to cross-examine defendants and experts and witnesses and argue with the judge and occasionally shout objection? How much they must sometimes have hankered to cross-examine each other, to put each other on the stand? It never happens, except in this trial it did. Amazingly, one of the things that happened in the Scopes trial was that Darrow cross-examined Bryan on the stand. Bryan agreed to do it partly because he thought in return he would get to cross-examine Darrow, which Darrow also agreed, but that never happened because the judge put a stop to it. The judge actually struck the cross-examination of Bryan by Darrow from the record. But we have a record of it. It happened in public. The jury weren't there, but the newspaper reporters were there. The townspeople of Dayton were there. By this point, the trial had moved outside. It was so hot and so crowded in the courtroom that some of it took place on the lawn in front of the courtroom, and that's where this cross-examination took place. And it is that cross-examination that, for many people, sealed the reputation of this trial as a contest not just between these two men, but between two worldviews, science, religion, and depending on your point of view, bigotry or bigotry. One side or the other was clearly a bigot here. And it's partly thanks to that cross-examination that this trial produced something else, which is one of the things you want from a great trial, which is a great movie, Inherit the Wind, which was first a play in 1955 and then a film in 1960 with Spencer Tracy playing a part based on Darrow. It was a film that was actually about McCarthyism. It was a defense of freedom of expression in the age of McCarthyite politics. But it became also, for many people, the definitive account of the Scopes trial. It played fast and loose with many of the facts, particularly the facts surrounding the circumstances of the trial, but it drew quite heavily on the transcript, and it made it a contest between these two men. So for all those reasons, this is the trial of the century. And yet, it's a very peculiar trial. It's very odd, unusual, quirky in many ways. So for instance, there's that amazing cast list. Scopes had almost nothing to do with any of it. The man who was on trial doesn't feature. He didn't take the stand. He was almost ignored by everybody throughout. And the reason for that, the reason it's such an odd trial, is that it was a kind of show trial, but not in the sense that we usually use that term. So, for instance, the next pair of episodes in this series are going to be about the Moscow show trials of the 1930s, the Stalinist show trials that were a complete farce, an attempt to put enemies of the state, so-called enemies of the state, renegades and wreckers, on trial and to contrive a case against them for political purposes, purely political purposes, no interest in law or justice. That kind of show trial is not what this was. It was a show trial in two different senses. First, it was a complete contrivance. What had happened was the statute came into force and the American Civil Liberties Union let it be known that they were looking for a test case. They wanted to challenge the statute, which first of all meant finding a teacher who had broken the law, having that teacher brought to trial. The goal was not to get the teacher acquitted. No one in this case wanted Scopes to be acquitted, not the prosecution, who thought he'd broken the law, and not the defense, who agreed that he'd broken the law, that he had taught Darwin and not the Bible in a biology class in Dayton, Ohio. In the mythical version of the trial, the one that actually is recreated in Inherit the Wind, Scopes is a young, idealistic, heroic biology teacher who believes in science and is determined to bring the good news of rational thought to the children of this little town. And he suffers for his faith, for his belief, his faith in science at the hand of the intolerant, bigoted Christian fundamentalist locals, the parents and others. That's not what happened at all. Scopes wasn't a biology teacher. He was a football coach. They just found anyone who could be plausibly said to have taught this stuff. He sometimes stood in as a substitute teacher when the science teacher was off. It's not clear he ever did teach Darwinian theory to school children in Dayton, but the children were told to say that he did on the stand. It wasn't about Scopes at all. They just wanted a stooge, essentially, to be convicted so that the case could be taken to a higher court. First, the Tennessee Supreme Court, but the hope was ultimately to the United States Supreme Court, because the argument was really about whether the Tennessee statute was unconstitutional. Did it, among other things, go against the First Amendment? Did it by saying that it was illegal to teach anything that denied the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible? Did it thereby establish religion in the state schools of Tennessee? And if so, surely that was unconstitutional. What they wanted was the statute struck off. So they needed a conviction. That made it a peculiar trial, but it was also peculiar because the reason it happened in Dayton is a conversation that took place in the town's drugstore, ran by a man called Fred Robinson. Fred Robinson's drugstore. A group of local businessmen were gathered there, and they thought, if we hosted this trial in our little town, a town that had been struggling, its population had more or less halved, its best days were behind it, only around 1,500 people lived there in 1925, it would bring in not just the newspaper men, but money and interest. It would, to use the cliche, put Dayton on the map. And it did put Dayton on the map. It made Dayton, Tennessee, a world-famous place. So it was also a show in that sense. It was deliberately contrived to be a kind of spectacle, to be a performance. And that was one of the things that Mencken mocked about the Scopes trial. Actually, to read his coverage of the trial, it's much more about Dayton than it is about the court proceedings. So he starts by saying he came to Dayton fully prepared to hate the place. He was expecting some poor little southern backwater full of bigoted, intolerant, ignorant yokels who are trying to hound a man simply for teaching basic science. That's not what he found at all. He said he found a nice place. He liked it. It was much prettier than he thought it would be. It was much more sophisticated. He met local people that he called the local intelligentsia. He didn't expect to find an intelligentsia in Dayton. And these people were smart. They knew what they were doing. And what they were doing was trying to create something that would gather the world's attention. And that is what Mencken mocked them for. Be careful what you wish for, was his message to the smart people of Dayton, Tennessee, because the case that they had brought and the case that they knew would gather the world's attention was only going to get the world's attention if the world was able to caricature Dayton as Monkey Town, as a place where the people are so, let's call it, dim. They can't cope with science. This is what Mencken wrote. The local intelligentsia venerate Bryan, the man they'd brought in to prosecute the case. They venerate Bryan as a Christian. This is a Christian town. But it was not as a Christian that they called him in, but as one adept at attracting the newspaper boys. In brief, as a showman. And Mencken went on, as I have said, they now begin to mistrust the show. Be careful what you wish for. You cannot outsmart the newspaper boys by trying to put on a show and then say, we don't really mean it. The result of what they did was to give Dayton a reputation that it lives with to this day. So that was part of the oddity, the sort of double game that was going on, a court case that was also almost show business. But it's also a curious trial because it was a trial. So for all of the show business, for all of the fact that so much of the argument had nothing to do with scopes, it was all about the Bible versus science. Nonetheless, it had to be squeezed into the format of the case itself. It had to be argued out through the case of Scopes, the high school teacher, who may or may not have taught from a book called Hunter's Civic Biology, which contained 5 pages of Darwinian theory and explanation of human evolution. The evidence of how confusing that could be comes from Darrow's closing speech. So this is what Darrow said at the end of the trial, in which he's absolutely clear, as he speaks to the jury, what they have to do, but also that what they have to do is not the reason that he's speaking to them. Darrow said, as far as this case stands before the jury, the court has told you very plainly that if you think my client taught that man descended from a lower order of animals, you will find him guilty. And you heard the testimony of the boys on that question, and you heard that they had read the books, and there is no dispute about the facts. Scopes did not go on the stand because he could not deny the statements made by the boys. I do not know how you may feel. I am not especially interested in it. But this case and this law will never be decided until it gets to a higher court. And it cannot get to a higher court, probably, very well, unless you bring in a verdict. So I do not want any of you to think we're going to find any fault with you as to your verdict. I am frank to say, while we think it is wrong, and we ought to have been permitted to put in our evidence, the court felt otherwise, as he had a right to hold. The court here means the judge. We cannot argue to you, gentlemen, under the instructions given by the court. We cannot even explain to you that we think you should return a verdict of not guilty. We do not see how you could. We do not ask it. We think we will save our point and take it to the higher court and settle whether the law is good, and also whether he should have permitted the evidence, he being the judge. Darrow finished, I guess that is plain enough. Well, it's not plain. I'm not sure I fully understand it. You have to bring in a guilty verdict. We wanted to bring evidence, and by that he means the evidence of expert witnesses, zoologists, scientists, and so on, whom the judge denied. He wouldn't allow them actually to bring expert witnesses to defend the truth of what was in Hunter's Civic Biology, because the judge said it's got nothing to do with this case. This case is not about whether that book is true or not true, a good book or a bad book. The case is simply about whether this man taught that book, and no one disputes what's in that book. No one disputes that that book goes against the statute. So if this man taught that book, this man is guilty. And Darrow says, given that, you have to find him guilty. But if we'd been allowed to bring our evidence, we could have made the case that he's not guilty. Well, that doesn't make sense because he would still be guilty. What he means is we could have made the case that we want to be heard by the higher courts, which is that this is a bad law because it prohibits the teaching of a book that contains statements that settled opinion has come to believe are the truth of science. And in the end, the argument that Darrow wanted to make was about the statute and the question of which of the two positions in that statute, the truth of Darwinian theory or the truth of the biblical story, which one of them is essentially a doctrine, a position, almost an ideology, and which one is the default or settled position. The people who wanted to say that the statute was constitutional did so on the basis that what was being taught by Scopes, what was in the biology textbook, was a doctrine, a kind of ideology. And of course, schools are allowed to decide what doctrines are and aren't taught in them. Of course, every state school has to be free to say, you can't go into the school and teach them this or that just because you happen to believe it, you happen to think it's true. We decide what's allowed in the school. That has to be constitutional. And it would be constitutional if you agree that Darwinian theory is simply a doctrine. But if you think that Darwinian theory is the default position of all right-thinking people, then it starts to look like the doctrine, the ideology, is the Bible. And if that's the thing that the Tennessee statute insists has to be taught in schools, a doctrinal position, then it starts to look like the establishing of a religion. And as Darrow did say to the court and to the jury, what he thought was going to happen, given the direction of travel, that is, it's going to be harder and harder to deny the science because the science will soon be everywhere, not just in the schools. You will be hearing it everywhere. That in order to defend the doctrine, the religion, the state was going to have to get more and more vigilant. Darrow said to the court, in a classic argument that echoes arguments made before and since, in all sorts of contexts, if today you take a thing like evolution and make it a crime to teach it in the public schools, tomorrow you can make it a crime to teach it in the private schools, and next year you can make it a crime to teach it to the hustings or in the church. The intolerance will spread if you allow it in the schools where you control the funding because they are state schools. In the end, to uphold your position, you will be behaving like an established church. You will be doctrinally insisting on the truth across the range of places in which people might hear opposing opinions. Darrow did say that in the court, but it wasn't what the case was about. And the court wouldn't give him what he wanted. The judge denied him the chance to put experts on the stand, to cross-examine them, to have Bryan cross-examine them and hope that Bryan was made to look ridiculous thereby. None of that was allowed because the case was simply the case of a schoolteacher doing something everybody agreed was illegal. And if it had ended there, Darrow wanted to turn it into this great performance about constitutional matters which could be considered not by this jury but by a higher court. And the court said no. The trial wouldn't have been as notorious, as celebrated as it became. The reason it achieved that notoriety was that even though the court said no, Bryan said yes. Bryan agreed to try the case on the terms that Darrow wanted to try it. That is, he agreed not to make it about Scopes, not to make it about did this teacher teach this or not, but to make it about the Bible, to make it about the truth. Bryan didn't get to give his closing statement to the jury because the judge decided it wasn't needed. After all, Darrow had conceded. But we do have a record of what Bryan would have said had he been allowed to sum up to the jury. This is what he was going to say. Again, force and love meet face to face. And the question, what shall I do with Jesus, must be answered. A bloody, brutal doctrine, evolution, demands, as the rabble did 1900 years ago, that he be crucified. That cannot be the answer of this jury representing a Christian state and sworn to uphold the laws of Tennessee. This would have been the last speech that Bryan ever gave. The speech that made him famous, the first national speech he gave, was at the 1896 Democratic Presidential Nominating Convention. Bryan, because of his speech, became the nominee. It's known as the Cross of Gold speech. It ended with Bryan saying, "You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold. And he finished that speech as a young man, standing in front of the convention. He put his arms out and he mimicked Christ on the cross. He mimicked the crucifixion. He identified himself with Jesus. Bryan was never afraid to raise the spectre of the crucifixion to defend either the people or the positions in which he believed. And in this case, unlike in 1896, when he was defending a silver currency, he was not defending the Bible. In this case, it was Jesus, in his mind, whom he was defending. He went on to the jury in the speech he never got to give. Your answer will be heard throughout the world. It is eagerly awaited by a praying multitude. If the law is nullified, there will be rejoicing wherever God is repudiated, the Saviour scoffed at, and the Bible ridiculed. Every unbeliever of every kind and degree will be happy. If, on the other hand, the law is upheld and the religion of the schoolchildren protected, millions of Christians will call you blessed, and with hearts full of gratitude to God will sing again that grand old song of triumph. Faith of our fathers living still, in spite of dungeon, fire and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy. Whene'er we hear the glorious word, faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death. That was the speech that Bryan wanted to give at the end of this trial. The judge prevented him. Among other things, it has that classic argument that's come up over and over again in this series, going right back to the trial of Socrates, which is you've got to convict, in this case, convict him, the schoolteacher, of breaking the law, because now it's reached the trial phase. Were you to acquit, just think what our enemies would do with that. Just think what they would do with the knowledge that this man has been let off. It's almost, now it's reached the trial, there's nothing we can do because we cannot allow them that victory. Got to convict Socrates because he'll be insufferable if you let him go. You've got to convict Scopes, not because Scopes will be insufferable, but all those people who refuse to celebrate the Christ will be intolerable. That was Bryan's argument. So he gave Darrow what he wanted because Darrow knew how to deal with that argument, which was to ridicule it. And then Bryan went further. He gave Darrow the thing I suspect Darrow couldn't believe he was going to get, which is Bryan agreed to go on the stand to defend that position, which means he wasn't there to defend Scopes, and he wasn't there to defend the prosecution, the thought that the laws of Tennessee should be upheld once they're on the statute book. He went into the stand to defend the Bible. And Darrow cross-examined him about what is in the Bible, not about what was in Hunter's civic biology. He asked him about various Bible stories. Did he believe they were true? On what basis did he believe they were true? And Bryan didn't come out of this exchange well. One of the questions that everybody wanted to know was why had Bryan agreed to be cross-examined by Darrow? And in the course of the cross-examination, he gave his answer. So one of the points that they discussed was the story of Jonah and the whale. And Darrow asked Bryan whether he believed it. Did he believe that the whale had swallowed Jonah? And did he believe it just because it was in the Bible? And to all of these questions, Bryan had the same kind of answer, which is, yes, I believe it. And I believe it because I don't really think about it, because I'm happy simply to take on faith what is in the Bible. And I don't really necessarily spend a lot of time trying to work out the literal mechanics of it. It's enough for me to have faith that if God was to want anything to take place in this world, it would happen. Or to allow anything to take place in this world, it would happen. And then Darrow said, well, would you believe it if the Bible said not that the whale swallowed Jonah, but Jonah swallowed the whale? And Bryan at that point said, the reason I am answering these questions is not for the benefit of the superior court. So he's saying, I know what Darrow is doing. He's trying to create a case here which he's going to take to a higher court where they will adjudicate on the constitutionality of the statute. And Bryan said, I'm not interested in that. That's not why I'm doing it. He said, it is to keep these gentlemen from saying, I was afraid to meet them and let them question me. And I want the Christian world to know that any atheist, agnostic, unbeliever can question me any time as to my belief in God, and I will answer him. Darrow then said, I want to take exception to this conduct of this witness. He may be very popular down here in the hills. And Bryan interrupted, Your Honour, they have not asked a question legally. like this cross-examination is a farce. But the only reason they have asked any question is for the purpose, as the question about Jonah was asked, for a chance to give this agnostic an opportunity to criticize a believer in the Word of God. And I answered the question in order to shut his mouth, so that he cannot go out and tell his atheistic friends that I would not answer his questions. That is the only reason, and no more reason in the world. I am doing this, Bryan said, so that he cannot go out and boast to his friends that he scared me off. I will answer any question, any time about my faith. And when Mencken heard this, because by this point he'd left the trial, he didn't actually witness Darrow's cross-examination of Bryan. He just read about it. But when he read and heard about it, it confirmed what he thought about Bryan, which is that this was a vast ego trip for him. This was not about scopes. It was not about the Bible. It was about how people treated William Jennings Bryan, their condescension, their gloating over his defeats, their belief that their view of the world had triumphed over his. Mencken said, I came to this conclusion, that what really moved Bryan was a lust for revenge. The men of the cities had destroyed him and made a mock of him. Now he would lead the yokels against them. Various facts clicked into the theory, and I hold it still. The hatred in the old man's burning eyes was not for the enemies of God. It was for the enemies of Bryan. And as Mencken went on to point out, if that's what Bryan wanted to do to get his revenge on the people who had mocked him, he did not succeed. Because the person who ended up being mocked as a result of this trial was Bryan. There were many parts of his exchange with Darrow that got circulated as the moment when William Jennings Bryan made a complete ass of himself. Probably the most celebrated is this exchange. This was about the question of the age of the earth. Famously, there is a way of reading the Bible going back through the generations to calculate how old the world is, when was it created, when was the creation, which gives you a date of about 4,000 years. Hunter's Civic Biology, the book being taught by Scopes, said that the human story was many, many millions of years old. Thousands versus millions. Darrow asked Bryan how old he thought the world was. Bryan answered, I never made a calculation. Darrow said, a calculation from what? Bryan, I could not say. Darrow, from generations of man, i.e., the classic biblical way. Bryan, I would not want to say that. Darrow, what do you think? Bryan, I do not think about things I don't think about. Darrow, do you think about things you do think about? Bryan, well, sometimes. It did not go well for Bryan. And so that cemented in many people's minds the moral of this trial, which was, although the schoolteacher was convicted, as he always had to be convicted, what Bryan gave the defence was what they needed. They gave the defence their stooge, their person to ridicule, in order that they should be seen to defend and uphold science, reason, education, rationality against what clearly emerged in Bryan's testimony as willful ignorance. Do you think about the things you do think about? Well, sometimes. So the conventional view of the Scopes trial is that it was a disaster for Bryan. It was really a disaster in the end for that kind of biblical view of the world, which was going to defend itself against science because there was no defence. Bryan had no defence. And though the case was lost, the moral victory was with Darrow. That is much too simplistic. There are three reasons why that story is a long way from the whole story. This cannot simply be seen as a kind of morality tale in which, though the law found for religion, the verdict of history found for science. Three reasons. Here's the first. In this case, Darrow and Bryan were clearly on opposite sides. Darrow stood for reason, Bryan stood for faith. But in other respects, in other aspects of American life and American history, Darrow and Bryan were on the same side. And one of those aspects is politics. They had a very similar political background in that they were both Democrats. In the 1890s and 1900s, they were broadly speaking on the same side of the Democratic Party. Bryan was a populist. Darrow is what was known as a Georgist. Both radicals in their different way, both campaigning in their different way for different things. And Darrow was briefly an elected politician, though not for long. They believed in a minimum wage. They believed in a far better deal for working Americans. They were both staunch critics of growing American imperialism under President McKinley. So they both campaigned against American actions and ultimately occupation of the Philippines. Anti-imperialists on the side of the working man, radicals in their way. They were on the same side of politics. And in that sense, this is a contest not between the two sides of American life, progressive, reactionary, rational, irrational, science and education versus faith and religion. Yes, it was those things, but those were two sides of what you could also see as an internal battle within the Democratic Party. And it's a battle that is not confined to 1920s Tennessee. It is ongoing. It wasn't resolved by this trial. Nothing about this trial resolved anything about that fight or, frankly, any of the other political contests that were going on at the time. Because in part, this was an argument about education and emancipation. So both Darrow and Bryan believed in the emancipation of ordinary working Americans. Bryan's was primarily the rural version. He was particularly concerned with the exploitation of farmers, people who lived on the land, people in the poorest parts of the country, people in the South. Darrow was primarily concerned with city dwellers. He wanted to take the fight to landlords. That was his Georgism, as it was called. He was an urban radical against the rural radical. But it was partly an argument about education because for someone like Darrow, education was the emancipation of ordinary Americans. And his urban perspective meant that he thought of education in those terms. For Bryan, education could be that, but it could also be one of the things that oppresses ordinary Americans. It comes from the outside. It comes into these communities from the outside. It tells people what to think, and it tells them to think like city dwellers. And city dwellers were the people for whom Bryan, in his politics, often had the most contempt because they didn't understand how ordinary Americans lived. They were remote in their cities on the plains. And education, particularly this kind of education, the kind of education that he was there in Dayton to condemn, was just another of the ways in which the elites of America impose their worldview on ordinary Americans. So for one side of this argument, which is an internal argument in the Democratic Party, education is the emancipator. And on the other side, education is a symbol of oppression. So that was happening 100 years ago. 100 years on, that argument has not been resolved. And the politics of the Democratic Party in the United States is still caught by that argument. Is education, particularly what education has become, not just high school education, but higher education, is it the thing that the Democratic Party should hitch its wagon to and tell ordinary Americans, this is your way out? Or should the Democratic Party be aware that for many ordinary Americans, it is not a way out, but it is a worldview that is being imposed on them by people who often mock them and use their education to look down on them? Darrow versus Bryan is that argument. It's an internal argument to the Democratic Party, although, of course, it's an argument that can be exploited, utilized, you might say weaponized on the other side too, and it is unresolved. The second reason the story is more complicated is that this was a trial about two books. Two lawyers, one man, Scopes, two books. I mean, there were many, many lawyers in this trial, but I'm boiling it down to the two best known ones. Actually, there were lots of other speeches on lots of other topics, but this is what the trial is known for. One of the books was the Bible. The other book was Hunter's Civic Biology, a textbook that had been published in 1914. So it was about 10 years old when this case came to court. It was being taught in Tennessee schools, including in the school in Dayton. The textbook essentially says that Darwin was a great man and that the science is now relatively settled. Mankind descended from other organisms, simpler organisms. Mankind is the most complex organism. It says that human beings are separated by a vast gulf from even the highest primates, from the monkeys, the chimpanzees, the gorillas. If you are asking about morality, there is a unfathomable moral bridge between humankind and the rest of animal kind. The textbook has no problem with that. But physiologically, human beings are closer to the higher primates than the higher primates are to the lower primates, monkeys. It's clear that we have something in common with monkeys. And by teaching that, if he did teach it, Scopes broke the law. It's not a strident book at all, except right at the end of the roughly 5 pages about evolution, where there's a little paragraph which is about the hierarchy, not of the animal kingdom, not where mankind, humankind stands in the animal kingdom, but the hierarchy within humankind. Because it also says there is a hierarchy there. There is a higher and lower, just as humans are higher and monkeys are lower, but connected. So the races can be structured from high to low. You're going to have to forgive me here. I'm going to use the language in the book. It does it by color. It says there are 5 races, human races. The lowest, black, or as it says, black African. Then you move up to what it calls the brown races, by which it says it means the peoples of places like India. Then you move up to what it basically calls the red races, what we would now call Native Americans. Then you move up to what it calls the yellow races, by which it says it means the peoples of Japan and China, the Orient, as it would have been called then. So it goes black, brown, red, yellow, and at the top, white. And it is unequivocal about that. It is more unequivocal about that than anything else in the evolution section. That is the hierarchy of man. It is a work of pure scientific racism, unabashed racism. The white Caucasian version of the human is the highest form, and the black African version of the human is the lowest form. That's the book that Darrow was defending should be taught in Tennessee schools. Now, of course, we're going to have a different view of that than people did in 1925. And you might say, well, this is 1925 Tennessee. Surely the people of Tennessee didn't have a problem with that in the sense that they were living in a Jim Crow world. They were living in a world there were not many Native Americans. They had been driven out or exterminated. There were very few non-white people from Asia in that part of Tennessee. So the hierarchy was straightforward, white and black, and no one in Tennessee in 1925 would be in any doubt that the white people of Tennessee placed themselves above the black people of Tennessee. So if that's what the book said, that's not the part of the book that the people of Tennessee had a problem with. Surely they would have had a problem with the bit that seemed to go against the teaching of the Bible. But that's not the only implication of Hunter's argument. The man who wrote the book, like many people at the time who were on the progressive side of politics, and indeed more broadly the progressive side of scientific thought, Hunter was also a eugenicist. He also believed that evolution taught us that we should try and promote the higher versus the lower. And that didn't just apply between the races, it applied within the races, within the white folk of America. There was higher and lower, higher being smarter, the educated, the elites, lower being the yokels, the hillbillies, the white trash. This was a book not in its biology section, but written by a man who elsewhere had been absolutely clear that he also believed that the white races of America should be very careful about who gets to breed and who doesn't. And who doesn't would have included the poor of Tennessee. So if the poor people of Tennessee instinctively felt that this book wasn't for them, it was partly because the author of this book didn't believe they should exist, or at least didn't believe that they should be allowed to reproduce in the way that the better whites should reproduce. Darrow had been a eugenicist. To his credit, he had renounced his eugenicism by the time of this trial. But Hunter hadn't. And that was the commonly accepted view of the people who believed in evolutionary theory at this time. It extended quite quickly into eugenic views of sterilization and the suppression of the reproductive possibilities of certain types versus certain other types. The people of Tennessee, including their representative in this case, William Jennings Bryan, understood that all too well. It's the subtext of this trial. It's not explicit in any of the testimony, which focused on the other book. It was all about the Bible. There was a sign outside the courtroom that said, "Read your Bible." And one of the arguments between Darrow and the judge was whether that sign should be taken down because it was prejudicial, or if it wasn't taken down, should it not have a sign alongside it that said, "Read your Hunter's Civic Biology." In the end, the judge agreed to take down the sign. The arguments were all about the Bible. Very little attention was paid to what was in the textbook because everybody knew the textbook said Darwin was right and therefore the Bible is wrong. That wasn't the only thing that the textbook said. And Bryan knew full well, not just in legal terms, but in political terms, just how toxic some of the evolutionary arguments were for the ordinary people of Tennessee. Not because they didn't believe them because it interrupted their naive faith, but because they knew where they thought those views might lead. And they weren't wrong. And then the third thing that complicates the story is that even if Darrow is thought to have won in the court of history, he did not just lose this case. His strategy didn't work. He didn't get his appeal. He didn't get it to the Supreme Court. It went to the Tennessee Supreme Court. And the Tennessee Supreme Court did the worst possible thing from the point of view of the people who were defending Scopes, which is they overturned the verdict. So rather than sending it up the chain to the Supreme Court, they overturned the verdict, but not on any principled ground, simply on a technicality. The Tennessee Supreme Court said of the merits of the case, the verdict was completely fine. This is from the judgment. We are not able to see how the prohibition of teaching the theory that man has descended from a lower order of animals gives preference to any religious establishment or mode of worship. So far as we know, there is no religious establishment or organised body that has in its creed or confession of faith any article denying or affirming such a theory. Well, obviously not, because the Bible doesn't say, don't teach Darwin. So I suppose they have a point, but actually when you look at the statute, it's stretching it. What they went on to say is, nonetheless, what happened in this case is that Scopes was found guilty. The jury were asked what the fine should be. The jury said, we don't know, and they deferred that to the judge who imposed a token fine. And actually, that was the mistake, because the jury alone was responsible for imposing the penalty. So actually, the judge made a mistake. He should have insisted it was the jury and not him. And for that reason, the court conveniently thought that it would overturn the verdict and it wouldn't ask for a retrial because no one's interest would be served by repeating that absurd circus. So the case was simply quashed. No further appeal, no arguments of principle. They dismissed the principle because the Bible is fine. Doesn't have anything to say about Darwin, so what's the issue here? And on we all go, and the statute remained on the statute book. Other states, not many, only a couple in fact, after the Scopes case, introduced their own statutes prohibiting the teaching of evolution in their state schools. One was Arkansas, and it was in Arkansas eventually that the thing that Darrow wanted happened many years after his death. It took until 1968 for the Supreme Court to overturn as unconstitutional a state law prohibiting the teaching of evolution. And it did it on the basis that, I quote, this is from the Supreme Court verdict in Epperson versus Arkansas, 1968. The overriding fact is that Arkansas's law selects from the body of knowledge a particular segment which it prescribes for the sole reason that it is deemed to conflict with a particular religious doctrine, that is, with a particular interpretation of the book of Genesis by a particular religious group. The key word there is particular. This biblical defense is not general, default, the way the world is. It is a group with a particular belief about a particular book interpreted in a particular way. If you impose that in a state school, you are establishing religion. The law is unconstitutional. Or as one of the justices put it, the states are most assuredly free to choose their own curriculums for their own schools. A state is entirely free, for example, to decide that the only foreign language to be taught in its public school system shall be Spanish. But would a state be constitutionally free to punish a teacher for letting his students know that other languages are also spoken in the world? I think not. But it took until 1968 for the Supreme Court to reach that judgment. So Darrow didn't win, or if he did win, it was in the very, very long run. But what is also clear is that Bryan lost. What happened to Bryan after the trial is that he carried on writing about the trial for a few days, all of these thoughts that he'd not been allowed to express because he wasn't permitted to cross-examine Darrow and he wasn't allowed to give his closing speech. He worked up as speeches that he was going to give around the county and then the country. Bryan was the great speechmaker of the age, and he had a lot to say about this case. He was still in Tennessee 5 days later. He was 65 years old at the time of the trial. Darrow was a little older. These were two old men fighting it out, something that Inherit the Wind captures very well. And Bryan, after a large meal, and he was a large man, and the heat was remorseless in July in Tennessee, he dropped dead. The trial effectively killed him. Or if it didn't, his death was close enough to the end of the trial for it to look that way. Mencken, when he heard of Bryan's death, wrote, I don't think you can call it an obituary because it's not in that genre, but he wrote a piece of journalism about Bryan and his life in the light of his death. I've never read anything like it. They say you should not speak ill of the dead, and to start with, Mencken suggests that the problem with his remarks about Bryan might be that he has become himself trapped in a sentimental mindset which holds people back from saying what they thought of someone just because that person has recently died. But as you'll hear, it doesn't really stop him. I want to read Mencken's, not obituary, but Mencken's view of Bryan in the immediate aftermath of the death of William Jennings Bryan. This is what he wrote. It is the national custom to sentimentalise the dead, as it is to sentimentalise men about to be hanged. Perhaps I fall into that weakness here. The Bryan I shall remember is the Bryan of his last weeks on earth, broken, furious, infinitely pathetic. It was impossible to meet his hatred with hatred to match it. He was winning a battle, i.e. the court case, that would make him forever infamous, wherever enlightened men remembered it and him. Even his old enemy Darrow was gentle with him in the end. That cross-examination might have been 10 times as devastating. It was plain to everyone that the old berserker Bryan was gone, that all that remained of him was a pair of glaring and horrible eyes. But what of his life? Did he accomplish any useful thing? Was he, in his day, of any dignity as a man and of any value to his fellow men? I doubt it. Bryan, at his best, was simply a magnificent job seeker. The issues that he bawled about usually meant nothing to him. Bryan was a vulgar and common man, a cad undiluted. He was ignorant, bigoted, self-seeking, blatant and dishonest. His career brought him into contact with the first men of his time. He preferred the company of rustic ignoramuses. It was hard to believe, watching him at Dayton, that he had travelled, that he had been received in civilized societies, that he had been a high officer of state. He seemed only a poor clod like those around him, deluded by a childish theology, full of an almost pathological hatred of all learning, all human dignity, all beauty, all fine and noble things. He was a peasant come home to the dung pile. Imagine a gentleman, and you have imagined everything he was not. So that was Mencken, thinking he might have fallen into the trap of sentimentalizing the dead. And he finished with this line: "The job before democracy is to get rid of such canaille." Canaille here is Southern French slang for rascal, utter rascal. The job before democracy is to get rid of such utter rascals. If it fails, they will devour it. Mencken's judgment on Bryan is monstrous. It is grotesque. It's also incredibly cruel, given that he had just died. But that was how Mencken saw him, and that was what Mencken thought posed the greatest threat to American democracy. Such men perhaps winning power. The job before democracy is to get rid of such absolute rascals. And if it fails, they will devour it. This is 100 years ago, and the conventional view of the Scopes monkey trial is that reason triumphed, superstition was exposed, the clodhopper was revealed to be a clodhopper, and the job before democracy is to make sure that such men never, never get the chance to rule the land. So if that is the job before democracy in the age of Donald Trump, how do we think it's going? We haven't mentioned this for a while, but as some of you will know, we do have a fortnightly newsletter that goes with this podcast. I write about something either from the podcast or that has grabbed my attention, but we also have clips and extracts and all sorts of things that we hope illuminate the episodes that you've been listening to. The latest edition of our newsletter is out now. It's free. It will be emailed to you if you just sign up. And to do that, all you have to do is click on the link in our show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. Not this newsletter, but the next newsletter will have lots of stuff in it about the Scopes monkey trial, including a clip from Inherit the Wind. Next time in Politics on Trial, as I mentioned then, I'm going to be talking to the historian of Russia, Edward Acton, across 2 episodes about what is perhaps the greatest travesty of justice of them all, a truly horrifying sequence of events and series of trials, the notorious Stalinist show trials that happened in Moscow from 1936 to 1938. We're going to be talking about the trials. We're also going to be talking about some of the works of fiction that they inspired, including not just George Orwell's 1984, but the book that inspired 1984. That's all next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.